Hi, everyone. My name is Kat Romano, and I'm the Programming and Human Rights Coordinator at the Montreal Holocaust Museum. I want to welcome you all to our virtual book talk, Once There Was a Town. Before we begin, I want to go over a little bit of housekeeping. Everyone will be kept on mute during the event, and today's discussion will be followed by a Q&A. And you can ask your questions in the chat. I'll be monitoring it throughout and make sure that our moderator receives all the questions. If you have any technical difficulties, you can message me directly and I'll do my best to help you. And now I'd like to pass it over to Rachel Groper, co-president of the museum.
Good evening, everyone. Hello, I'm really pleased to be here with you. My name is Rachel Kruger-Groper, and I'm the co-president, as Kat mentioned, of the Montreal Holocaust Museum, and I'm very honored to welcome you tonight. I'm proud to present this event this evening for our museum and in partnership with the Toronto Holocaust Museum and the Vancouver Holocaust Education Centre. It's especially delightful and heartening to see our communities across Canada come together to honor a history that belongs to us all. And I hope this is just one of many events that we will work on together. As a survivor speaker of the Montreal Holocaust Museum, I often talk about the weight of what was lost. But tonight we focus on the opposite and how we reclaim it. We're here to discuss a remarkable new book, Once There Was a Town, and I'm dying to say it in Yiddish, Siz gewen amol a Shtetl, for anybody who understands Yiddish, which explores the yizkor books created by survivors after the war. These memory books were quintessentially Jewish response to unimaginable horror and destruction, a way to rebuild our vanished towns page by page through testimony and love. At the Montreal Holocaust Museum, we see ourselves as the living custodians of these stories. Like a yizkor book, like a memory book, our museum enshrines the memory of the past so that it may never be erased. This commitment to legacy is why we are currently in such a transformative moment. I'm thrilled, delighted. Everyone who knows me knows how I cheer about this information, that our mission and vision will soon have a magnificent new home. In the summer of 2027, and I always say it with my fingers crossed and prayers that I'll be there, we will open our new museum in downtown Montreal, where our community started, ensuring that the voices of survivors and the history of the Holocaust remain at the heart of our city's consciousness for generations to come. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce our guests this evening. First, let me present our featured author, Jane Ziegelman. In addition to tonight's Once There Was a Town, Jane is the author of the now classic 97 Orchard, an edible history of 5 immigrant families in one New York tenement. I can relate. A Square Meal, her culinary history of the Great Depression, written together with her husband, Andrew Coe. And she's received, and this is something, a James Beard Award. I believe Jane lives in New York and in Brooklyn, and we welcome you most heartily. Joining Jane in conversation is Glenn Kurtz. He's the author of 3 books of nonfiction, Men at Work, The Empire State Building, and the Untold Story of the Craftsman Who Built It. And those of you who know that story a little bit know about the great photographs that Louis Hines produced. His previous book, 3 Minutes in Poland, Discovering a Lost World in a 1938 family film, which was named Best Book of 2014 by The New Yorker, The Boston Globe, and NPR. A documentary film based on the book 3 Minutes, A Lengthening, directed by Bianca Stichter, co-produced by Academy Award winner Steve McQueen, and narrated by Helena Bonham Carter. We could ask you questions about all of that, can't we, Glenn? Premiered at the Venice Film Festival in 2021. a New York Times Critics' Pick. It was an official selection of the Sundance Film Festival in 2022 and received the inaugural Yad Vashem Award for Excellence in Holocaust Documentary Filmmaking. Glenn's first book, Practicing a Musician's Return to Music, received enthusiastic reviews from the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal. They all still exist, right, Glenn? And elsewhere was featured in NPR's Weekend Edition with Scott Simon. The recipient of the 2016-2017 John Simon Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship, Glenn graduated from Tufts and the New England Conservatory of Music, and he holds a PhD from Stanford. So it is my honor, Jane and Glenn. We have two extremely wonderful presenters. It's all yours.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much, Ray, and thank you, Kat. It's a wonderful pleasure to be here. And Jane, good evening.
Good evening.
I want to start with kind of a general question that occurred to me. Somehow, like it's like the foundation in a way for everything I think that both of us have done. But can you talk a little bit about what Poland, what the idea of Poland, the idea Poland, what that meant to you in the time before you wrote this book? Maybe even going back to when you were a kid. When you
Okay,
heard that
so
word, what did that mean to you?
that's a really interesting question for me. The way I thought about Poland is, and this is something I wrote in a little essay that was reprinted in the English edition of the Lubomel Yizkor book. This was how I described Poland. When a Jew gets depressed, that's Poland. And I thought of it as a place, I mean, as a small person before I understood there was a Holocaust, I thought of it as a place that you wanted to get out of, and particularly if you were a Jew. And in family conversation, that's the way my family spoke about leaving Poland, always with those words, get out. They got out. And sometimes they got out just in the nick of time. So an amorphous, almost like a place that you might see in a Brothers Grimm fairy tale, a place that maybe was cursed, and particularly cursed if you were a Jewish person. So in short, I viewed Poland with a lot of negativity, and negativity in short toward people like me.
Mhm. Well, I guess the follow-up question, maybe in a sense by contrast, is what did the name Lubomel mean to you then?
Yes, that meant something interesting, complicated. I knew it was part of Poland. I mean, as a young person growing up, that it was in Poland. And I come from a secular Jewish family. My relatives, however, were devout, observant Jews. And when I spent holidays with them, they would sing at the dinner table, and they would sing, the Sabbath hymns. And in their faces, I saw something that I had never experienced. And I thought, oh, that's Lubomel.
Mm.
That, what I saw, a joyfulness, a closeness to something holy. I saw that, and I connected that with Lubomel. At the same time, I knew that Lubomel was a very difficult place to live in. So it was a mix of both something that was very good and very special and very beautiful, and a kind of beauty that I had never known in my own life, and that I yearned for, but also a place that was very dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting always this extraordinary contrast in a sense between the feeling about the country, but
Right.
then this attachment to the Heimat, to the Heimat, the sort of the hometown, which
Yeah.
is often extremely warm and, as you say, joyous. Um, so if you go back then to that time when your family, when you were a kid and your family would talk about this, what what was your impression of what it meant to them? Like how did you internalize as a young person, um, well, the story that you would ultimately learn as a grown up, but how did it emerge for you at that time in the family context?
I I saw Lubamo as the core of their identity, and therefore, in some way, it has to be the core of my identity.
Mm,
The different family members had different ways of relating to Lubamo. For my grandmother, it was clear she never left
mm,
Lubamo. And when the family came together, it was almost as if I could feel the presence of the town in the room with us, that they carried Lubamo to the United States. And despite the need to get out, you know what? They never did get out, not entirely, especially for my grandmother, for whom Lubamo was connected with terrible tragedies. Um, my father, for my father, Lubamo was the launch pad that made him into a successful businessman. Because as he told it, as a kid in Lubamo, Americans would come back to the town with gifts. And that was the man that he was going to become. He was going to become the guy that came back with toys for all the children. And of course, he never had that opportunity. And in some way, I connected his hunger for success in the business world with a kind of compensation for the fact that he was never able to return with gifts for the children.
wow. Well, maybe leaping forward then. So if it was your father's sort of, as you say, a sort of compensation that propelled him to success in business here.
So
What about for you then? Um, what do you think was it about what you inherited from that family circle that made you ultimately want to come and write this book?
So I was intensely curious about this town. Um, as a small kid, I began keeping a kind of mental dossier on these little fragments of information dropped by the grown-ups. And for instance, I learned that in Lubamo, when my father went to class, his teacher, instead of calling him on him by name, would say, "You, dirty Jew." What kind of world? In what kind of world does that happen? I had never experienced any kind of anti-Semitism growing up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, which in its own way had the qualities of a shtetl. Um, so this was extremely intriguing. I knew that it was a poor town, and I had never known poverty. So this was something else that I found. I thought about adversity. I thought it was a place where people had to overcome adversity, and that immigrants were also people who overcame adversity. And for this reason, they were really heroic figures. And I saw my family as heroes, all of them, for what they had overcome. Not exactly sure if I'm getting at your question, but it was a town, it was a place that heroes came from. And I wondered, could I be a hero too? Did I have that in me? I saw it in my father and my grandmother and my uncles. And I wondered if I had that potential. And I wished that I did. And I still don't know if I could be.
Do you think of the book in a sense as your sort of foray into finding out about it?
Yeah,
Right.
very
Yeah,
much so.
that's interesting. Well, I mean, one of the things I think we talked about previously was how often the families that there was a boundary of silence. However much the family was willing to speak about their lives and the town and even express their love for it and share the traditions about it, there was always a boundary of silence at a certain point beyond which it was not possible for them to speak. And as a child, I think
Right.
it's very hard to try and trespass across that. Do you have any recollections of sort of when you became aware of that boundary and what effect it had on you?
I think me and all the kids, the grandchildren, understood that there were questions that we weren't supposed to ask. And it's very hard to reconstruct how we knew that, but all of us knew that. All of us knew that something had happened to my grandmother that had left her severely damaged. We didn't know what it was, but we knew not to ask. You know, in Jewish tradition, you're given an Anglo name and a Jewish name. My Jewish name was Chava. And I knew that it had something to do with people in Lubamo. But it was only on writing this book that I understood that that was the name of my great grandmother who was killed in the war. So I was carrying this name. And this is a revelation that came to me during the writing of the book. So, and I think this is something that's true in a lot of Jewish families, that we're walking around with the names of our murdered relatives. That's a lot to carry. I think it was that boundary, it eroded slowly. And I don't know if there was a moment of awareness. There certainly was awareness. And um, and in this book, I tried to bust through it.
Did you ever have the chance to ask them directly, any of your relatives, or was that something that a silence that remained for their lives?
Never.
No.
It seemed like it would be an act of cruelty
Mm.
to press on any of these questions.
Well, that sort of basically asks the question, but I want to ask it anyway. So, what
Yeah.
was it that then brought you to write this book? What was, what did you want to accomplish by writing it?
I wanted to go to Lubamo. I wanted to be there. I wanted to walk the streets that my family walked. I wanted to be able to navigate the streets and see what they saw, and maybe even feel some of the things that they felt, and smell some of the smells that they smelled. I wanted to experience this place in I know I'll never be able to experience what they did, but in some kind of approximation through imagination, experience what they experienced. Why this is so important to me, I still don't know. I mean, for you, Glenn, did you have any of those feelings that you wanted to know what it was to be there, to see the sights and hear the sounds of what that your ancestral town was?
That's interesting. I mean, I came to this history quite differently because of a film that my grandfather made. So he left in the late 1880s, early 1890s. So it was quite removed from me. And I never met him. So it wasn't like it was something that was discussed, what life was like in the old country over the dinner table. So it was quite removed to me. But when I discovered the film,
Yeah.
and this was of a trip that he took in 1938 to revisit this town where he was born, where he had not grown up, but nevertheless, something that remained. I think his mother was still alive. It was something that was still important to the family. As soon as I saw that film, it wasn't that I wanted to know what it was like to be there. I wanted to understand what I was looking at.
I
in this
see.
film, and who these people were. And of course, I mean, I had literally inherited their memory. And so I felt a tremendous responsibility to try to honor that
This is
memory.
something that I've been trying to articulate, and you being very articulate guy, maybe you can help. In remembering these towns, built into the remembering is a kind of wish, a wish that it hadn't happened the way it happened, that the war hadn't come, that for sort of flashes, you could imagine that that world is still there. Did did you ever have, I mean, it's so, was there ever a kind of wishing built
Hmm.
into your research?
Well, I certainly experienced it in relation to my grandfather. I really wish I'd had a chance to sit down and talk with him about this.
Okay.
Um, I don't know, maybe my imagination isn't strong enough to overcome the awareness of what happened. And so, insofar as I felt the wish to meet these people or know them, it was always inextricably bound up with the knowledge that that
You
couldn't
knew.
happen. So it's more of a
See,
longing.
sometimes that knowledge would break down for me.
No, that's interesting. Speak about that a little bit.
Um, so when you're reading, we really haven't discussed what a yizkor book
Yes,
is.
that's where we were getting right now. Yeah.
Should we say
Please.
what it
Yeah.
is?
Talk about
Okay.
a Yisker book.
So a yizkor book, it is in essence an anthology written by Jews from a particular shtetl. So these were all members of the same community, many of them survivors, who wanted to create some kind of written record of what life was like in their town. That was one of their objectives. The second objective was to document the destruction of their towns during World War II. So in this one volume, you have these two very different goals meeting up, one bound up in life, one bound up in death. And yizkor books are written in the voices of everyday people, people that you could imagine are sitting across from the table from you, and people that are very familiar to you because they're like your grandparents or they're like your father, or maybe even they're like the Jews in the Catskills in the Borscht Belt. You hear echoes or pre-echoes of what you've come to know as sort of Jewish culture. And where am I going? I'm not sure. But where am I going?
Well, you were talking about what, so the motivation for writing a Yizkor book, what a Yizkor book is. But yeah, I mean, you say in your book that, you had all of these questions that remained unanswered in a sense in the
Correct.
context of your family, but you found many of those answers in the Yizkor book. So
And
maybe, yeah, talk about what it was like for you then to enter into the world of the Yizkor book. What brought you in that direction?
I found out, I knew about poverty and I knew about want and deprivation. I found out exactly what that looked like. And there were different ways of knowing. You can know in a sort of general sense, people were poor, people were hungry, but there are different ways of being poor and there are different ways of being hungry. And I found out the way that they were hungry and the way that they were poor. And um, it brought a reality, a realness to the poverty that I hadn't known before when it was when it was an amorphous, when it was an idea of poverty. So this was really important to me to nail down sort of generalized concepts in a concrete reality, in a physical reality. That was important. I also learned how Lubamel met its end. And it was much more horrible than anything I could have imagined. And that helped me understand why my grandmother would cry with no visible prompt at the dinner table, always dabbing her eyes. And it helped me understand why my father grew up with this voracious appetite for success it was outsized, and it really, in the end, sort of ate him. So yes, those were some of the answers that I found in these yizkor books.
When did you discover the yizkor book specifically for Lubamo?
Right. I discovered the Lubamo yizkor book when it was translated into English in 1998. And so I was a full-fledged grown-up. But for reasons, again, this story is still a mystery to me. And I haven't worked it all out. For reasons that I don't entirely understand, I didn't delve right into it. It took me another 20 years before I cracked it open and felt that I was ready to enter this world of this shtetl. And then I understood that this Lubamo yizkor book wasn't alone, that it was part of a vast body of literature. And as that idea gained traction, I realized this is something I have to tell people about. This is really important for Jews, but for everybody. That there are records, that there are written records of a disappeared world. We have to know that these records exist.
Yeah, that's just one of the most interesting things about your book is this, that you didn't, I mean, I think the sort of obvious direction would have been to take the Lubamo yizkor book and sort of make that the centerpiece of your story. But in fact, you went out and read many of these, or
hundreds.
Hundreds. Well, I would be very interested. Yeah, can you talk a little bit about what that experience was like, going into this vast literature of the yizkor books?
Well, on one level, I felt like I was meeting members of a very vast family, and I was part of that family. There's a lot of overlap between one town and another, and between what the residents of one town say about life in their town and what the residents of the next town say about life in their town. So you really see a civilization. You don't just see an isolated town. You see towns that add up to something much greater. I felt like people were talking to me and that I was in some kind of conversation with them. I was the silent part of the conversation. They were the voiced part of the conversation. But I wanted to know all about them. I wanted to understand all the things that a shtetl can be. And it could be different things in different places. And it was different things in different places, but with a lot of commonality. And for instance, Sabbath in the shtetl. That's one, the yizkor book writers, whatever their political views, whether they were Hasids or not Hasids, whether they were believers or not believers, they all came together on the idea of what Sabbath meant in the shtetl. And it meant, first, it meant the cessation of work, and it meant the cessation of worry. Worry and anxiety were undercurrents, very powerful undercurrents of what it meant to live in a shtetl. And for those 24 hours during the Shabbos, those anxieties and those worries were lifted, and the relief of not feeling those pressures was immense. So that's one of the takeaways for me of what connected one shtetl to another. was the experience of Shabbos.
Yeah, it's such an interesting subject because, I mean, when you survey this larger landscape, as you say, it reveals a culture, not just a town.
Right.
Um, and so you spend a lot of time talking about what the sort of constituents of that culture were, market day and a sort of experience of food, for example. So, well, since you're a food expert, maybe you can talk a little bit about, yeah, what did you learn in that sense from looking at this broad spectrum of yizkor books about, yeah, about the life and food as life.
Well, something that you'll see a lot in yizkor books is reference to a particular metaphor. And I believe it's a metaphor that comes out of Jewish mysticism. And the metaphor is this: the world that we live in, this world, this table, this body, this chair, this is the mundane world. It's a vestibule, it's a waiting space. And there's a door in this vestibule. And on the other side of the door is the world to come. And the world to come is imagined as a banquet hall. At one end of the table is God, and at the other end of the table is King David. And one day, redemption, when we're redeemed, when the Messiah comes, that door will swing open. And we will finally sit down at the banquet table and join our foremothers and forefathers, the patriarchs and the matriarchs. On the Sabbath, that door is cracked open and a little bit of light is emitted. And on the Sabbath, Jews reveled in that light. Now, the food of Sabbath was considered a literal foretaste of the foods that we will eat in the world to come. So gefilte fish, we will really eat gefilte fish in the next world, although it won't be made of carp. It'll be made out of a biblical sea monster. So we will really eat the meats that we eat on the Sabbath, but it won't be from cows. It'll be of a biblical beast, more delicious than anything that we can eat in our world. So this idea that you were tasting redemption, that it was a taste of redemption. And I had never understood food that way until I read this book. So this, you understand that food, we think a lot about food, us Jewish people. Every time, if you're devout, every time you pick up an apple, you pray, you say a prayer for it. And this was another way, sort of apparatus of beliefs that we have built up around food. It was very powerful. So when I eat now, I eat differently. I think about food differently. I mean, this was, I guess what I'm trying to say is this: the lows were very low. The highs were extremely high. And I don't know if I've ever experienced those kinds of, you could call them joyous moments or moments of uplift or of transcendence, but it was available. Shtetl Jews did have availability to these moments, these flashes of transcendence. And I guess I'm envious of that. I hope I'm not romanticizing. And I don't think I am, because I saw it. People talked about it in very plain language, that part of shtetl life were those flashes of transcendence.
Well, it's one of the most fascinating things about this sort of yizkor book literature. I mean, as second, third, fourth generation descendants, our inheritance is in so many ways much larger than we have any way of grasping, and much of it is unexplained. And what you're describing is sort of finding, in a way, in these yizkor books, the explanation for traditions that you were handed down, that were handed down to you, that you didn't understand the meaning of at the time. And so it enriches, in a sense, your memory of what you experienced and
Very much so.
gives a context that you didn't have as a younger person. Are there any other examples that you can think of that were powerful for you in that way, that the yizkor books sort of made sense to you suddenly, something that you'd sort of inherited without knowing that you'd inherited it?
Well, as the secular family in a family of highly observant Jews, I I always wondered what they thought of me. And I knew they felt there was something wrong and that there was a degree of they felt sorry for me that I didn't have what they have. And you see that in the yizkor books of the devout sort of taking pity on their sons and daughters who will never know the richness and the holiness of what it really means to be a Jew. So that sort of I got clarity on on they felt sorry. They pitied me.
Well, precisely that sense of transcendence that you were describing,
That's
that you
right.
didn't experience, they
That's right.
sort
And
of
they knew
believed
that.
that you didn't have it. That's
That's
interesting.
right.
Well, you said we referred to this earlier, that you had gone to the yizkor books as a source to answer questions that hadn't been answered in the context of your family. I'm very curious, what wasn't answered that you wish had been answered?
Got to think about that one for a minute. What wasn't answered? I've never asked myself that question because what I found was so rich. I'm sure there are things that weren't answered, but maybe there are things that have to do with myself, not about the world, but the mysteries. And I think we all have mysteries living inside of us. I still don't understand why me, not my sister. Why was I the one that took on this um, almost like a fetishistic fascination with this world? And maybe part of the conversation that we've already had answers that, is the sense that I didn't have something and I could see it around me in my family members, and I was looking to find that in myself.
Well,
Maybe.
so that's a nice bridge then to talk about sort of your writing of this book, and how do you see your book fitting into the yizkor book tradition?
Well, I see yizkor books as an attempt to conjure a lost world back into existence. And what I hope in my book is that on some level, I've done a little bit of the same. And my hope is not that you stop with my book, but that book is a bridge to reading yizkor books. So I guess I wanted to emulate in a smaller way what I thought yizkor books had done on a much grander scale, and that it would be a stepping stone
Mm.
to look at that body of literature, which is so fantastically uh, fertile, fecund and fertile, and filled. I mean, just the information. In your book, Glenn, you talk a little bit about rescuing details. Every detail that I read was precious to me. um, the way the dogs would bark when the butcher brought his meat out, the barking of the dogs on market day. And, you know, dogs are they occupy a kind of ambiguous and ambivalent place in shtetl culture. Jews were not dog people. And I don't know if you remember this from the book, but the day that my grandmother went to the mitzvah to be cleansed for her impending marriage, the first thing she saw was a dog. And she had to go back in to get repurified. I wanted to understand that. I wanted to understand the what did you eat for breakfast? I wanted to understand what kind of shoes he or she wore. I wanted to understand, did he have shoelaces? Well, no, because if you're a religious Jew, you don't have shoelaces. A shoelace would be considered the adoption of something secular and modern. So a person with a shoelace was already a suspect individual. It was already on the road to modernization. I wanted to understand that life on that kind of detail. And I got very interested in clothing and what clothing was allowed and what clothing was, which items of clothing were forbidden. I wanted, so I don't know if these are the best examples of the kind of detail that I was interested in, but I wanted to preserve every detail. And of course, you can't do that. I always forget the question that where we started.
Well, I mean, what you described, it's very familiar to me because, I mean, when you're speaking about a lost culture, then every surviving fragment is important. You
That's
know,
right.
as archaeologists, you know, a broken potsherd is powerful and meaningful.
Exactly.
It's not anything important in the context of the culture, in the sense that, you know, it was just some pot, it broke, you threw it out. Nevertheless, if that's what remains, then that's what we have to build our conception of the culture from. This might be a moment, just sort of as a sidebar, if you want to point our listeners to where they can find yizkor books that are also translated into English.
Okay, so this is important. There are yizkor books in libraries around the country and libraries around the world. But if you're not a Yiddish or Hebrew reader, the place you have to go is a website called Jewish Gen. It was a website that was created primarily for people interested in doing genealogical research, but which sort of expanded its program and launched a translation project, and now has hundreds of yizkor books in translation online. And that's where most of my research was done. So this is if you come from a town or if you have any interest in knowing anything about these towns, you have to go to Jewish Gen. It's extremely important. And many of these translations are now available in hard copies. So you can order a hard copy. And these hard copies are also behind the desk at the New York Public Library and in many other libraries that have some kind of Jewish collection.
Yeah, that's Jewish Gen is it's the start and ending point, I think, of so much of this research.
That's right.
I have just two more questions that I want to ask, both of which we could probably spend an hour talking about. The first one is, you mentioned that in so many of these yizkor books, the authors, in a sense, sort of confess or bemoan their own inadequacy to the task. And you just mentioned that, again, these details, you don't know how important they are or whether you did them justice in a sense. But
Right.
can you talk a little bit about that sense of, you know, I think all of us, when we come to this history, we stand in the face of something so immense and so impossible that failure is just a given. We're never going to be able to
Correct.
achieve what we want.
Words, yeah, all the books in the world and all the words in the world can't bring this world back. And that's that. The yizkor book writers approached their task with tremendous humility and thoughtfulness. If you read yizkor books, you'll see in these introductions a lot of wrestling with why this book needs to exist. What do we hope to accomplish? What do we think we will never accomplish? And why do we think we're not up to the task? There's a word in Hebrew, and the word is yirah, and it means a sense of fear of the divine, fear and trembling in the face of the divine. And that was the attitude with which yizkor book writers approached their work, with a sense of fear and trembling at the importance, the mission that they had set for themselves. They knew that they could never do it justice, but they had to give it their best try. And that's the way I guess I felt as well. I don't think I can do this as a body of literature. I can't do it justice, but I'll do the best that I can with the resources that I have. And I don't know, I guess I'm someone who believes in humility as a human trait. And it was tremendously moving for me to see those confessions, to read those confessions of inadequacy. I mean, these were people, they didn't have the educational background to write like academics, but they were there and they saw it. They had something more important. They had their eyes and their ears and their experiences. And that's all we can ask from them. And it's intensely valuable. What they have is as valuable as any scholar or as any academic.
This isn't the last question that I had, but what you just said made me want to ask this one in the middle.
Yeah,
and that
sure.
is, so, so what does a second generation person bring to this that the yizkor authors didn't or couldn't see themselves? So they were the ones who experienced this or who had the experience of the town, even if they had left before the war. They knew the place. We, and particularly you, it's a place that came to you in a sense as a legend. So what is it, do you think, that you bring to the story that's distinct from what the first generation, the survivor generation, brought?
Urgency.
Mm-hmm.
Urgency that the voices of that world are disappearing, and we have to do something about it. We have to make sure that they don't go silent. Their voices are preserved in yizkor books, but that means nothing if nobody reads them. So I see my mission as making sure that the world knows these books are there. And, the yizkor book writers understood that with distance, memories would fade. I feel it. I see it happening. That was something they imagined, but I have one Lubamo relative alive, my dad. And when he dies, that's the end. That's the end in our family. And what's happening in my family is happening on a societal level. So I feel that urgency. I think that's one of the things that I bring.
My last question, and I'll take this moment to invite everyone listening, if you have questions, to please post them in the chat. Have you had any contact with the current residents of Lubamo?
I went to Lubamo with my father and a small group of landsmen, meaning people from that town. This was years ago. It was before the yizkor book was published. And before I knew what questions to ask, before I understood how this town would take over a big chunk of my life. And it was a very confusing trip because the people who live there now are living in Jewish houses, and their grandparents may have been collaborators, and their their way other members on this trip of return felt is that they were living in stolen houses, and there was a lot of tension. However, there was also in this town, he was a Ukrainian who had made it his business to become the town historian, who was collecting all kinds of information about former Jewish residents. And it's my understanding that a lot of these towns have these local historians. And that was really interesting to me. And that's something that if I do another project, I would like to understand those men and women who, for reasons of their own, are rescuing this lost history. So yes, I would like to understand what these historians are doing and from where it's coming from within them.
Yeah, it's actually quite a characteristic thing in small Polish towns. There's usually one person who
Yes,
self-elects to be the
that's right.
keeper of memory.
That's right.
And it varies, it could be someone who lives in the former rabbi's house, it could be a school janitor or a school principal, or it's someone. And there doesn't seem to be any sort of socioeconomic characteristic that corresponds to who chooses to do this,
I
but
mean, can you
someone
imagine a
does.
book on these people and that
Yeah,
phenomenon?
absolutely. This brings us a sort of full circle since I asked, in a sense, what Poland meant to you when you were a child. I have to mention now, again, as a sidebar, the organization called the Forum for Dialogue, which is a Polish-based non-government organization whose explicit purpose is to foster dialogue between Poles of Jewish and non-Jewish heritage, and particularly to support precisely these people, and to bring them into a network, because often it's an isolated person, it's an
Yeah,
unpopular job, and it doesn't win you a lot of friends necessarily in your local town, but because there is someone also in the next town and the next town after that, to put those people into contact with each other to form a network. And
that's really interesting.
this organization, it's an extraordinary and remarkable organization also for anyone who's considering a trip back to Poland.
Yeah,
Um,
very interesting. I'd love to
um,
do that.
so what does Poland, if there are no other questions from the audience, I'll just end with this one, but what does Poland mean to you now?
What does Poland mean to me now? Well, oh, sorry, the cat is now trying to get in on the actions. Um, in light of what's going on in Ukraine and the Polish support that is being given to Ukraine, Poland, from being the bad guys in my story, has taken on a new kind of persona. Goes on at unofficial levels in Poland, and the refusal to recognize certain aspects of anti-Semitism in Poland pre-Holocaust. I'm not sure. Do you have a feeling of what Poland means to you?
My experience, again, we go back to this sort of dichotomy between the nation and the hometown.
Yeah,
And I've
that's
had
right.
quite a lot of contact since my book came out with the local town that's depicted in that film, Nashel, just outside of Warsaw. I've spent, I've gone back there almost every year since the
Oh,
last
really? Wow.
12 years, um, and been engaged in local projects and local projects of remembrance. So reclaiming the cemetery insofar as that's possible, putting up a memorial and informational signs, collaborating with the local history museum on their section on the Jewish life of the town. And in general, very much under the guidance of the Forum for Dialogue, trying to engage in conversation. This was, however,
I would
you
love
know,
to be part of that in whatever way.
yeah. And the amazing thing is, I mean, sort of the impression I think of Poland that we inherited, which is often one of extraordinary bitterness,
Yes.
um, and anger, um, and betrayal,
Yes.
um, is not necessarily the well, it's often not the most helpful attitude when you go to
Correct.
visit for a start. It's also maybe not the appropriate one anymore, because the
Yes.
third generation in Poland,
There are no
um,
young Polish
is
people
not the
now
same,
learning
is not the
Yiddish.
same as their parents and their grandparents.
That's right.
Um,
And that has to be recognized.
and that has to be recognized. And it's a much more sort of diverse response to this idea of engaging with this history, than I think we're often led to believe. Um, and so, yeah, I think that often for the children of survivors, particularly, but any descendant, there's a sense that if unless we maintain the anger and the sort of bitterness toward Poland, we're not honoring the suffering of our ancestors. Um, but I'm not sure that that's a sustainable equation. I think that in a sense that anger supplants a kind of mourning. And if you approach the townspeople in an attitude of mourning, you'll find that suddenly there's an enormous amount of mourning that goes on there as well for the loss that their town suffered. It's not the same loss that our ancestors suffered, but it was mixed together in the same way that you describe on Market Day. The
Mhm.
Jews and the non-Jews were completely mixed together. I do see that one question has come in, and maybe in our last minute we can turn to
Sure.
that. And that is, what do you think that the yizkor book reveals most about the town and your family?
So there's a lot of conversation about the mythologizing of the shtetl and romanticizing of the shtetl in certain scholarly circles, that there's a lot of anxiety that that's what we do, that we Jews do. I disagree. I mean, what I found is that there was something, a sense of community, a sense of neighbor taking care of neighbor. I mean, just in the way that there were very elaborate charitable organizations set up to take care of the poor, of orphans, of women who were too poor to pay for their own dowries. There was a sense of we're all responsible for each other that I would love to reincorporate into our Jewish lives today. And I don't think that that's a romanticized vision of the shtetl. I think that that was real. And part of it comes out of the fact that these were such small communities. These were face-to-face communities. They're not big cities with anami and anonymity. So that's partly a function of their smallness. But I think that it was also something rooted in always open your door to strangers. Every Sabbath table, at every Sabbath table, there should be a stranger. We have to feed the poor. All of these things, if we could reincorporate them into who we are today as Jews, would be wonderful. Um, is that partly what you're what you're
I,
asking?
I think it's a beautiful place for us to end,
Oh, thank you.
in an aspirational sense, to learn from what
Yes, there are some,
precisely that thing that you felt was missing and try and strive
yes,
to achieve it.
yes.
Well, with that, I'll hand it back to Ray, and thank you, Jane, so much.
Thank you, Glenn.
Whoops, Ray, you're muted.
Ray, oops.
I sound much better muted.
Good line.
Thank you for this wonderful gift of getting to know Lubomel and Nazielsk. And you've prompted me. I have a shopping list of questions, and we don't have time for them, but I'm going to drop a few hints. I've always had difficulty differentiating nostalgia from transcendence. And I'm the last survivor in my small family unit, though there are some relatives beyond that in other parts of the world. But I could never differentiate the difference between the nostalgic remembrance and the actual transcendence that you were describing, Jane. And what you described as a value system, we call tikkun olam. It's something that we still hold by. And I was so delighted that you mentioned the younger generation, because when I returned to Poland, and I've only been back once, I felt the discomfort and all that baggage that I had heard within my family. And I found that the younger people were much more open and were more susceptible to discussion. And I can't resist, Kat, I know I'm taking a little longer, but bear with me. I can't resist your question about heroics. My mother was the hero of our family without question. And I would ask her about that. And she often said, that she didn't know it was in her until confronted with the circumstance, that it wasn't something that she could prepare for or understand. So I have to say thank you. I can't keep talking. I have to say thank you to the Toronto Holocaust Museum and Vancouver Holocaust Education Centre. I sincerely hope we'll have other opportunities. This wasn't nearly enough time. Kat, we have to do some more of this. And before I say goodnight, I want to remind everyone that our interest in these themes doesn't end here. As a special extension of tonight's program, we've arranged for an opportunity for you to watch the documentary 3 Minutes, a Lengthening. This extraordinary film, based on Glenn's book, provides an even deeper look at the faces and lives we talked about and you heard about tonight. And it's available through our website until March 1st. So I encourage you to set aside time to view it this week. I certainly will. And I've got my reading list, and I hope I have other opportunities, Jane and Glenn, to talk with you again. And thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight virtually. And we look forward to maintaining our legacy and having other programs like this. Thank you, Kat, for your effort as well.
Thank you, Ray.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.